Welcome to the debate. Imagine surviving a deadly, hyperlethal trap. You managed to narrowly escape a pendulum blade that it was literally milliseconds away from cleaving you in half.
Yeah, an absolute nightmare scenario.
Right. You catch your breath, you look down, and you realize your right hand, the very hand that activated your escape mechanism, has instantly aged 30 years. The skin is withered, the knuckles are swollen, and the flesh is just completely gray and dying.
And it's permanent, which is the truly terrifying part.
Exactly. So the central question we're looking at today is this. Is that horrifying mutilation just the harsh mathematical cost of doing business in an unforgiving universe? Or is the very building you're standing inside actively eating you alive?
Which brings us to the topic of our discussion, the terrifying dimensional nexus known as the Broken Tavern.
Yes, and we are drawing directly from the source material today. So we're looking at the Codex rules, the environmental observations, and those really harrowing records from the Void Syndicate's incursions.
Which are just, they are grim to read.
They really are. But looking at that evidence, I stand firmly on the side that I view this structure as an automated, impartial cosmic anchor. It is essentially a machine strictly enforcing the mathematics of reality.
And I completely disagree. I argue that the Broken Tavern is a starving, living organism that deliberately engineers failure to consume its victims, acting as an apex predator in architectural form.
Well, let's unpack that. Because to really understand the Tavern, we have to look at what it actually does on a macro scale. We are told explicitly that the Tavern serves as the ultimate cosmic pin. It anchors an endless nexus of universes and timelines together. Without its immense magical gravity, the boundaries between oceanic realms, alien voids, and industrial war timelines would just shatter.
Right. It prevents catastrophic convergence. I don't dispute its function.
Good, because that function is key. My perspective is that this place is a structural necessity. It's a high-stakes, persistent system, right? So when introducer triggers a consequence, the Tavern balances the cost without distinguishing between success and failure.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. If you look closely at the text, it doesn't describe a passive bridge. Or an indifferent scale. It explicitly defines the Tavern as a living, breathing anomaly.
But living in a magical sense could just mean...
Let me finish this thought because the text also says it is fundamentally starving. This place weaponizes its own environment. It purposefully shifts its Gothic corridors and sci-fi machinery to exploit the very specific psychological and physical fracture points of whoever walks through its doors.
So you think it's literally reading their minds?
It reads intent. It reads emotion. Yeah. The permanent scars it leaves on its survivors, the literal flesh tax exacted on these working-class wizards and adventurers, that proves it is a predator consuming vitality.
Wait, let me stop you there. When you say it's an apex predator, are we talking about like a metaphor for a cruel, punishing ecosystem? Or do you mean it literally possesses biological functions and malice?
Oh, I mean it literally, absolutely.
Because if we look at Rule 10, the law of temporal weight, I see strict mathematical causality. But you're framing it as targeted cruelty, which I think is a leap.
Rule 10 is actually the perfect place to start. If the Tavern is just a neutral machine, as you claim, the law of temporal weight shouldn't feel so sadistically precise. The rule dictates that survival inside the Tavern isn't protected by plot armor or narrative destiny.
Right. The universe doesn't care if you're the main character.
Exactly. But the Tavern doesn't just deduct arbitrary magical energy or hit points when you fail. It permanently mutilates you in highly specific ways. Think about the people forced to navigate this place. They are working-class mercenaries, fledgling mages who don't have high-born protections.
Like Talon.
Yes, Kalen the Chronomancer. He is fleeing that pendulum blade trap we talked about in the intro. In a moment of sheer desperation, he pushes his temporal compass too far.
Which is incredibly dangerous. Chronomancy is all about borrowing time.
It is, but what does the Tavern do? It doesn't just make the spell fail or backfire. It literally takes 30 years out of his right hand. It leaves him permanently withered and crippled.
Well,
And look at Silas, the cartographer. His legs were entirely erased by a non-Euclidean collapse in the architecture.
a spatial paradox, yes.
But the Tavern didn't let him die. It replaced his legs with luminous cyan armor specifically to anchor his suffering body to the structure so he could keep mapping it. And Valerius, who survives with a permanently flayed, smoking skull that radiates unnatural cold.
Valerius is a very unique case, though.
But the pattern holds. A genuinely neutral system would simply let an intruder die if they failed a parameter. This system specifically keeps you alive so you can feel the loss. It expertly butchers its prey, taking exactly enough to keep them moving and feeding the Tavern.
I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective. I don't see butchery here. I see equivalent exchange.
Equivalent exchange?
Yes, think of it this way. If a person reaches out and grabs a live, high-voltage wire, the severe burn they receive isn't the electricity acting with, malice. It isn't a predator deciding to hurt them.
A live wire is an inanimate object.
Exactly my point. It is simply the violent, mathematical transfer of energy. Kalen's aged hand isn't a sadistic punishment. We really have to look at the mechanics of the temporal compass.
I know the mechanics. He fractured time.
Right. He borrowed 30 years of temporal acceleration to physically outrun a trap. The Tavern, as an anchor of infinite timelines, cannot allow temporal depths to exist, or the fabric of reality unravels.
So it just takes it out of his flesh.
The timeline demanded that 30 years be accounted for physically. The system didn't single Kalen out to torture him. The system just collected the debt he initiated.
But a live wire doesn't selectively decide to replace a cartographer's legs with cyan armor just so he can't leave. That requires an intent to keep the subject useful.
Silas's non-Euclidean collapse wasn't a choice made by a conscious mind, though. Non-Euclidean geometry in this setting represents spatial paradoxes.
Okay.
When Silas's physical form couldn't reconcile with the impossible geometry of the hallway, his legs were excised by the physics of the space. The cyan armor was a structural manifestation of Rule 10.
You're saying the armor was just math?
It was the system anchoring a contradictory physical mass to prevent a local dimensional tear. It's harsh, absolutely, but it's not malicious. And look at Dravok.
Oh, Dravok is a brutal example.
He literally melted his own arms to fuse his massive great axe directly into his forearms with molten slag and charred flesh. Why? Because he needed to shatter obsidian without oxygen.
Yeah, it was horrific.
But the Tavern didn't impose that horror on him. Dravok made that choice out of an absolute refusal to die. The Tavern merely permitted the physical consequences of his dark karma and raw anger to take their natural, devastating course.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered the underlying mechanism of how the system adapts? An electrical wire doesn't rearrange its corridors into a personalized crucible designed to test your specific emotional weaknesses.
I don't think it's personal. I think it's reactive.
It implies a consciousness studying its prey. But let's test your theory. If the Tavern is an unfeeling, mathematically absolute machine, equations cannot be tricked, physics cannot be hacked.
Ah, I see where you're going with this.
So how do you explain what happens when the conspiracy theorists in the lore actually manage to usurp the system? We have to talk about the so-called root directory hack.
You're bringing up Zolthon, the biomechanical void caller.
I am. Zolthon is the ultimate case study for the biological predator theory. Here we have an alien entity with total vision loss, deep scarred sockets because he paid the price of his own arrogance against the Spire lasers.
A price the system enforced impartially, I might add.
Sure, but listen to what he does next. Zalthun doesn't just try to cast a normal spell against the Tavern. He deploys a burgundy void lattice. This isn't just magic. It's a literal manifestation of dimensional usurpation.
He projects it into the combat scenario, yeah.
And he crosses two fingers and achieves what the text explicitly calls partial administrative recursion. He effectively injects his own corrupted magical frequency into the Tavern's structural code. By matching the Tavern's dimensional resonance, he tricks the architecture into recognizing him as the administrator.
Which sounds exactly like a computer hack, not a biological interaction.
Not when you look at the host's reaction. The architecture literally bends to his command logic, like a fever breaking.
A fever breaking is just a metaphor used by the scholars.
But he commands a tavern guardian to stay silent, and it obeys. He casually siphons monocores directly out of the system's constructs. A rigid mathematical equation doesn't just hand over the keys because a new variable shows up.
Well, if the variable mimics an administrative credential,
A biological entity, however, can be infected. It can be manipulated by a parasite. Zalthun usurps the dimensional essence of the tavern because he is acting like a virus, mimicking host cells in a living bloodstream. He forces the host organism to yield to his commands.
that's an interesting point, though. I would definitely frame it differently. I am highly skeptical of Zalthun's supposed victory here.
Really? He was controlling the Guardians.
Only briefly. In fact, if we look closely at the constraints of the lore, I question the validity of this hack entirely. The source material specifically notes that Zalthun only thinks he hacked the tavern.
He had functional control of the sector.
He genuinely believes he has accessed the root directory, but he's fundamentally wrong. When he deploys that Burgundy Void lattice, the tavern doesn't lose control in a biological panic. What does the system actually do?
It hesitates. The text literally says the system hesitates, as if unsure whether it is about to receive a command or become one.
A processing delay is not fear. Think of it like a highly advanced computer operating system.
Here we go with the IT metaphors.
Hear me out. If a malicious, incredibly complex virus enters the system, a truly sophisticated OS doesn't just crash, it quietly places the virus into a quarantine sandbox environment.
Oh, I see.
The virus looks around the sandbox, executes its malicious code, and thinks it completely owns the hard drive. But it is entirely contained. When the tavern encounters Zalthun's dimensional usurpation, it simply reclassifies him.
Reclassifies him as what?
It designates him as an emergent governing anomaly. It then partitions the entire Void Syndicate, separating Orion, Vexus, Dravok, and Valerius into highly controlled isolation corridors.
Right, it traps them.
It doesn't do this out of a biological panic. It does this to run diagnostics, to study their parameters, and to gather the data necessary to deploy an optimized countermeasure. It is a purely automated machine learning response to a corrupted file that refuses to be read normally.
I come at it from a completely different way. You call it a computer sandbox. I call it a Venus flytrap.
A Venus flytrap?
Yeah. A Venus flytrap doesn't quarantine a bug to run a diagnostic on its flight patterns. It traps the bug because the bug's movement triggered sensory hairs. It initiates a biological process to slowly, methodically digest it.
That's a very dramatic reading of a partition.
That is exactly what those isolation corridors are doing to the Void Syndicate. The Tavern isn't sequestering him to run code, it's sequestering him because his Void Lattice caused indigestion, and the organism needs to isolate the parasite before it spreads.
But if it were a Venus flytrap, it would just secrete acid and dissolve him immediately. Instead, it categorizes him. It labels him an emergent governing anomaly. That terminology is distinctly administrative, not biological.
The terminology is just how the scholars and the text try to rationalize an entity they can't comprehend. But if you want to look at how the Tavern genuinely responds when it's pushed to the brink, we have to look at the immune response.
The excision engine.
Exactly. When the flytrap finally closes, it doesn't just quietly delete the file or balance an equation, it responds with absolute, visceral, violent horror. Let's talk about the karma excision engine.
Now, this is where I actually think the impartial machine theory is strongest.
Really? Because this is the most monstrous part of the lore?
But mathematically sound. The karma excision engine is the literal manifestation of two core directives. Rule 2, the law of the grinding, and Rule 9, the law of systemic excision.
Right. Rule 9.
Rule 9 is very clear about its mechanics. If a combatant inside the tavern embodies absolute evil, meaning their existence is intended solely for functional destruction of the realities the tavern is trying to protect, the system bypasses standard evaluation and moves straight to deletion.
Deletion. You're using such clinical terms for something so deeply horrific.
Because the mechanics are clinical. Look at how the engine compiles its response. It acts on alignment data. The abyss splits open into vertical layers of archived failure, and the engine literally calculates what is needed to neutralize the Void Syndicate.
And how does it do that?
With corpses.
The Syndicate is hyper-specialized, so the engine builds a perfect counter-logic. Yes, it uses physical material. It stitches a swordsman's arm to a cleric's hand. It fuses a mage's skull to a shield-bearer's chest.
It's disgusting. It isn't doing this to be theatrical. It is mathematically combining the archived combat data of past adventurers to formulate a countermeasure that the Syndicate's specific abilities cannot overcome. It doesn't fight out of anger. It is a pure, unfeeling immune response repairing a fractured reality.
I'm completely unconvinced by that line of reasoning because you are entirely ignoring the sheer sadism of the presentation.
Sadism implies pleasure. The machine feels nothing.
A truly neutral system, an impartial line of code, would just eradicate the anomaly. It would turn off the lights, it would collapse the floor into a black hole. But what does the Karma Excision engine actually do in practice?
It creates a localized threat too.
It rises out of the abyss as a towering altar skull. The fused statues and corpses inside the skull begin screaming, and the scream isn't just a loud noise or an alarm, it hits the intruders like a physical force.
A sonic wave is just physics.
It literally cracks the stone of the floor. It forces a thermal overload in Dravok's molten iron arms. Remember how he fused his arms? The scream makes that metal flare white hot, cracking his fused skeleton from the inside out.
But even Zelthun, the so-called hacker, notes in that very moment that the screaming is not random. The audio frequency is transmitting alignment data. The terror is just a byproduct of a massive localized data transfer.
Oh, come on. That is an incredibly cold interpretation of a machine that is wearing human remains. You were looking at a screaming skull made of dead, working-class wizards and calling it a data transfer.
I'm calling it efficient use of available resources.
This is where we hit the core of my argument. The Tavern is essentially a capitalist stronghold choking on its own consumed history. It wrings every last drop of usefulness out of the flesh tax it has collected over millennia.
Capitalist stronghold is an interesting way to phrase it.
It fits. It didn't just take Kaelin's 30 years of youth or Silas's spatial presence and discard them. It hoards them. It keeps every piece of trauma, every broken adventurer, and recycles them into its own immune response.
To protect the multiverse?
No. To parade its previous meals in front of its current prey to weaponize psychological terror. That is not an impartial physics engine. That is a starving, gluttonous entity that refuses to let anything go to waste. It ensures the failure of these working-class adventurers so that it can continue to build its own twisted architecture out of the people who dare to step inside.
I do understand the emotional weight of that perspective. The imagery of the Karma Excision engine is, without a doubt, undeniably horrific.
Thank you.
But I think we have to separate human emotional perception from cosmic necessity. Valerius, who possesses one of the most analytical minds in the Syndicate, observed something profoundly clinical about the system during that exact same encounter.
What does he observe then?
He watches how the system deals with Lord Orion. Orion is this armored tyrant wielding the corrupted, shattered sunblade. He's radiating power and absolute defiance. But Valerius notes that the system did not actually defeat Orion.
It didn't.
No, it invalidated him. Orion was resisting a system that fundamentally does not require his resistance to function. It simply stopped recognizing his physics.
Wow.
To me, that implies a structure based on absolute rules. It implies a mathematical framework that can simply erase participation itself. Yes, the Tavern is a cosmic pin bearing the weight of infinite realities. The violence, the stitched-together corpses, the screaming data transfers, to our human perception, that is a nightmare.
A literal nightmare.
But to a dimension that must prevent the total catastrophic collapse of oceanic realms, alien voids, and dying medieval worlds all crushing into one another, that horror is just the necessary absolute law of the system operating at peak efficiency. The Tavern is impervious to the arrogant hacks of entities like Zolthan because it doesn't care about arrogance. It is mathematically absolute.
And I maintain that framing it purely as mathematics gives the Tavern far too much grace.
Calling it efficiency sanitizes the reality of what happens inside those walls.
I wouldn't say I'm sanitizing it, I'm explaining it.
It is a living nightmare. It is an apex predator that dynamically, maliciously adapts to ensure your failure. The permanent flesh tax exacted on characters like Silas, Kalen, and Valerius isn't just a temporal accounting trick to balance the universe. It is a biological harvest.
We just read the harvest differently.
The violent, screaming immune responses, the way it shifts its geometry to specifically trap you, the way it isolates its prey in Venus flytrap corridors and studies their psychological fracture points, all of it reveals an organism actively consuming those who cross its threshold. The Tavern doesn't just balance the scales of reality, it drinks the blood spilled on them.
Well, we have explored deeply divergent views today, digging into the very mechanics of how this terrifying space operates. But I think we can find profound convergence on one undeniable reality.
Which is?
The staggering, irreversible cost of stepping into the broken tavern. Whether we are looking at an unfeeling cosmic machine strictly enforcing temporal weight and dimensional physics, or a starving organism actively feeding on failure and harvesting trauma, we absolutely agree that survival here demands a permanent ledger.
Right. A ledger etched literally into the body and soul of every adventurer who walks through those doors.
Exactly.
Absolutely. There are no untouched heroes leaving this place. No one walks out whole. Whether it's driven by math or by malice, the Tavern never ever restores what it takes from you. The price of admission is a piece of yourself, forever.
Which brings us back to the broader implications of the material. When you look at the oppressive systems we navigate, both in fiction and in reality, it forces us to ask a profound question.
Are the brutal environments we endure simply broken by an unfeeling, impartial design? Or are they driven by a predatory hunger that relies on our suffering to sustain itself?
Precisely. There is far more hidden behind the infinite, heavy oak doors of this material to explore. Perhaps the true nature of the Tavern lies somewhere in the dark space between the blueprint and the anatomy. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.